Afternoon, folks. Hope everybody is doing okay today. This is going to be part 2 in our lecture series concerning the origins and fundamentals of the Kingdom Animalia. If you have not already watched part 1 of this lesson, I recommend you go back and do that first so you have some important background information on what we define as an animal and on the origins of animals. If you are in my General Bio 2 class, you might want to hop on the Blackboard site and get a copy of the summary notes for this lesson so that you have important vocabulary and dates in front of you for reference with all this, especially because we're going to be introducing some unfamiliar terminology as we go along here. Also, if you have access to it, again, from my Blackboard site, or if you can find it somewhere on the internet, you might want to get your handy-dandy geologic timescale, have that handy if you do, so that you can reference some of the geologic blocks of time I will be talking about and have some sense of when they are taking place. All right, so we left off having talked about the origins of the Animalia, the most basic and fundamental animal-like organisms appearing somewhere between about 1 billion and 650 million years ago, that we know that the common genetics shared by all animals can be clocked via molecular clocking about to 650 million years ago. And we're looking at the origin of the earliest definitive animals somewhere around 610 million years ago with the Ediacaran fauna in Australia. But I want to pick up a little bit further ahead. We mentioned an organism called Dickinsonia last time, about 558 million years ago, oldest fossil that we can look at and definitively say, yep, that critter there is an animal. It does animal things. It is producing cholesterol, which we found in the fossil, which is an animal-exclusive lipid. So, let's advance the clock a little bit. Let's talk about a little bit of the history of the Animalia since its origins. Now, animals, at least initially, were not terribly sophisticated. We were looking mostly at sponges and worms and things along those lines. The Kingdom Animalia really took off at the beginning of the Paleozoic Era. And for those of you unacquainted with the geologic time, the Paleozoic, capital Paleozoic, is a geologic era that began 542 million years ago and ended approximately 251 million years ago. Those sound like arbitrary dates, but remember all of our blocks of geologic time are sorted on the basis of important geological events or important events in the history of life. The beginning of the Paleozoic, 542 million years ago, is marked by a very significant event that we call the Cambrian Explosion, capital Cambrian, Cambrian Explosion. Gets that name because remember that every era of geology is divided into periods of time, and the Cambrian period begins 542 million years ago, goes till about 488 million years ago. Actually, that moment, 542 million years ago, is a watershed moment in geology because it's not only the beginning of the Cambrian period within the Paleozoic Era, it is also the beginning of the Phanerozoic Eon, capital Phanerozoic, Phanerozoic. The eons are the biggest blocks of geologic time. Life first emerged at the beginning of the Archean Eon, 3.9 or so billion years ago. Animal life first appeared during the Proterozoic Eon, went from about 2.5 million years ago at the end of the Archean to about 542 million years ago. That's when we first start seeing our basic sponges, our soft-bodied invertebrates, the simplest things we can call animals. But we are currently living in the Phanerozoic Eon. That is our current eon of geologic time, began 542 million years ago. First era of the Phanerozoic was the Paleozoic. First period of the Paleozoic was the Cambrian period. Phanerozoic Eon is divided into 3 eras, the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic, which is the era we are living in at present. But let's wind this back a little bit. So 542 million years ago is when we open a new era, a new period, and a new eon. Watershed moment in geologic time. And all of this is because of that event known as the Cambrian Explosion. Now, the Cambrian Explosion is not a literal explosion. It's not a volcanic eruption or a meteor crash or anything like that. The Cambrian Explosion is an explosion of new life. 542 million years ago, there is a minor oxygen revolution. We have a brief spike in oxygenation levels, corresponding with a warming period in the planet's oceans. That combination of greater temperature and higher levels of oxygen meant that animal life, which remember is a very active form of life, animals are motile, animals therefore require a lot of energy, way more so than plants or fungi do, because moving around is a very energy costly thing to be doing. So whenever you have more oxygen available for organisms that rely on aerobic respiration, it becomes easier to make ATP. So this spike in atmospheric oxygen levels, this minor oxygen revolution, corresponds with a dramatic expansion of diversity in the Kingdom Animalia. And between about 542 million years ago and about 525 million years ago, we're going to have this incredible period in which life becomes so much more diverse than we know it, and animals in particular really begin to thrive. Now, all the animal life in this time period, I should point out, is marine life. All animals begin in the oceans, and all animals are going to remain in the oceans for quite a while. So the Cambrian Explosion is specifically an expansion of marine animal species. A lot of important things happened during the Cambrian Explosion. The development of many of the Hox genes, the developmental genes that control development in all animals, is going to happen during this time. We're going to see most of the Hox genes that are carried on by modern animals appearing during the Cambrian period. And we can molecularly clock them back from existing animals to this time. There's a tremendous expansion of new animal life, tremendous variety of different kinds of organisms. Fully half of the phyla of animals that are alive today appear for the first time during the Cambrian Explosion, as well as several phyla that no longer live at all. There are numerous kinds of animals that appear during the Cambrian that have no living descendants today. But we're going to see a very wide range of new kinds of animals. The Cambrian is going to see the emergence of the first arthropods, that is your joint-legged animals like your crustaceans and your insects. We're going to see the appearance of the first cephalopods, that is your squid, your octopodes, your soft-bodied tentacled mollusks. We're going to see the emergence of the first echinoderms, that is the starfish, the sea stars and their affiliates. The emergence of the first gastropods, slug and snail-like animals. The first definitive sponges, a number of different kinds of worms. And very importantly from our standpoint, the first chordates, members of the phylum Chordata, the phylum to which you belong. These are all things that appear for the first time during the Cambrian. A lot of this is driven by the growth of not only Hox genes, but also by something that's new to the animal environment. Now that we have lots of kinds of animals moving around in the oceans, we have a very vibrant and active ecosystem in which, for the first time, animal competition becomes a significant part of the story. There are now enough kinds of animals that competition between them becomes a driving force in natural selection. In other words, we have the emergence of resource crunches. We have selective pressure being imposed on one animal group by another. Now, this is life's experimental period. This is when the animal world tries out a whole lot of new models to see what works. And a lot of the animals that appear during the Cambrian Explosion are, by modern standards, bizarre, even monstrous-looking organisms. Our best fossil formation from the Cambrian, by the way, is a Canadian fossil bed located in British Columbia called the Burgess Shale. Hard to imagine now, but what is today British Columbia was a warm, wet environment back in the Cambrian, a warm sea. And there we see a huge range of Cambrian fossils. A lot of our Cambrian era fossils come from that specific fossil formation, so keep that in mind that we're only looking at a small amount of the total fossil diversity of Kingdom Animalia from that time period, because as with every era of fossils, the overwhelming majority of living things didn't fossilize. So we only know a little bit about what's going on based on what we still have. But even then, we see a tremendous range of strange looking animals. And I have some crappy black and white pictures to show you because I don't have a color printer right now to work with. But here's some examples of some fossils of the sort of life you can see occurring during the Cambrian. In the upper left-hand corner, that critter you see right there, that sort of ovoid thing with the multi-layered shell upon its back, that is one of many examples of an entire group of arthropods called the trilobites. The trilobites were bottom-dwelling organisms in the Cambrian. They crawled along the seabeds looking for food. Trilobites were an incredibly diverse group of arthropods, one of the first arthropod groups, if not the first. We have discovered in the fossil record no less than 17,000 trilopod species. Trilobites, not trilopod, excuse me. Ranging in size from trilobites that would fit on your pinky fingernail to trilobites the size of a table. Now below that thing, we have a great example of the bizarre sorts of life that we are getting during the Cambrian. That organism right there is called hallucigenia, given its name because it looks like something you might have seen in a hallucination. Hallucigenia's anatomy is so bizarre that until very recently, we weren't even 100% sure which end was the head, or if it even had a head in the modern sense. Current thinking is the head appears to be right about there. And that thing in the lower right there, sorry, lower left there, not a very good picture. That is an organism called Marella. Marella is going to be a really important organism because it is a bottom-dwelling arthropod believed to be at the root of modern crustaceans like shrimp. But my favorite Cambrian animal is what that thing you see in the upper left right there. That is Anomalocaris. Anomalocaris is part of a large group of organisms. There were several different species that have been discovered within its genus, ranging in size from centimeter long to as long as your arm. Now check out Anomalocaris. It's got some really nifty features. We've got a stabilizing fin along its back for more effective propelling in the water. We have a tail fin for generating speed. We have huge eyes. Those eyes are actually preserved in the fossil record because they have a crystalline lens, which is still with us today. So we still actually have Anomalocaris' eyes to look at. It was a multifaceted crystalline eye. And look at those appendages at the front of the animal's body. Those are not tentacles. Those are not jaws as we know them now. They are actually a kind of specialized mandible, a specialized sort of appendage for the grasping of food. Anomalocaris is a really important organism because it is arguably the earliest known predator, the earliest known active predator that is chasing its food down. The emergence of active predation in the early oceans is going to be incredibly important selective pressure. It's going to change the entire ecosystem because now everything is either predator or prey. And therefore, your predatory animals are developing adaptations like better vision and better speed and grasping appendages for grabbing hold of and tracing and killing their prey. Whereas your prey animals now have to develop defenses against another animal that might want to eat them, whether that means developing their own natural weaponry to fight off a predator, whether that means developing armor plating, whether that means developing poison or other features to deter a predator, spines or something like that, or whether that means simply getting big enough that you're not a threat to the predator, or the predator isn't a threat to you. In fact, that particular bit of the evolutionary arms race becomes quite important, and you'll find that a lot of prey organisms respond by getting larger. And then the predators respond by getting bigger too, until eventually you end up with some truly massive animals appearing during the Cambrian Explosion. Now, throughout the Cambrian period, we're going to see continued expansion of how life is going to work out. The earliest fishes are going to appear by about 525 million years ago, right around the end of the Cambrian Explosion, which means that we now have vertebrate life, animals that have an endoskeleton, an internal skeleton with a backbone, a skull, and that sort of thing. Not every chordate is necessarily a vertebrate. Chordates appear a lot earlier in the Cambrian, but vertebrates don't show up until about 535 million years ago. The first fishes, as we know them today, appear around 525 million years ago. By the end of the Cambrian, we are seeing extraordinarily large animals starting to appear. By about, 460 to 400 million years ago, we are getting fish the size of school buses. If you go to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, in the gift shop there's a wonderful skull on display of an armor-headed fish called Dunkleosteus. Armor plating on its skull, parts of that armor plating eventually migrated into the mouth and became the first teeth. And Dunkleosteus, at full maturity, was an animal that was about 30 feet long and weighed in at more than 4,000 pounds, an apex predator of its time. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves. So the Cambrian Explosion shows a tremendous range of new kinds of animals appearing and whole new ecological strategies, which then other living things in turn have to develop around. We are building a complex interlocked ecosystem of different animals and plants interacting with each other in a wide variety of ways. Now, all of this is initially happening in the oceans. The entire Cambrian Explosion is taking place in the sea. But throughout the Paleozoic, life diversifies more and more. By approximately 460 million years ago, we are having the first tentative creeping onto land of simple animals. Now, if you want to go on land, you need to make some special adaptations, don't you? Being on land means, A, you got to prevent desiccation. Right there, that's a super important thing. You have to find a way to not dry out in an atmosphere. It is no surprise, perhaps, that the first land animals were arthropods, your crustaceans and things like them, because they have a hard external shell that is a waterproofed shell and therefore can help them to retain water. Furthermore, you have to be able to support your own weight against gravity. Therefore, your land animals need better musculature and better structures for motility. Having an endoskeleton is going to be super helpful for this. There are plenty of land invertebrates. Most of them, however, are arthropods. And you're going to find that in the not too distant future, land vertebrates are going to really take off. You've got to worry about breathing in an atmosphere. And you're going to find that a lot of our early land dwellers can't do so terribly efficiently. Basically, they have to return to the water to breathe periodically, or they even keep a little pocket of water in their shell circulating over their gills. Basically, we start off with animals that can creep onto land for short periods of time. It is believed that the transition of arthropods from a strictly aquatic life to a life at least partially on land was an adaptation of moving from one tidal pool to another. An animal that was a bottom-dwelling animal, a little creeper like a crab of some kind, that was able to sustain itself outside the water for a short time while it climbed into another nearby body of water searching for additional food. This proved to be a super effective strategy, so as time went on, natural selection favored more and more adaptations for staying out of the water longer and traveling further. Pardon me. Until you eventually had a critter that could stay out of the water full time. Vertebrates take a bit longer. The invertebrates have the land to themselves for about 100 million years. The transition to land-dwelling vertebrates begins about 375 million years ago. The first land-dwelling vertebrate is a critter you've already heard about if you've taken this class with me previously, an animal called Tiktaalik rose, capital T-I-K-T-A-A-L-I-K, Tiktaalik. Rose, lowercase r-o-s-e-a-e, Tiktaalik rose. This is basically a fish with feet. It's going to be from a group that we call the lobe-finned fishes, which become quite common in the Devonian period and the Silurian period. Silurian period begins 416 million years ago, ends 359 million years ago. The lobe-finned fishes have thicker, fleshier fins, which are stronger, more musculature, enabling this animal to pull itself along on the bottom. Tiktaalik rosei had a very flat body. It was a big animal. It was about like 5-6 feet long, but a very, very flattened body that it seems like it was adapted to shallow water dwelling, that it lived in the shallows. That was a good way to escape from much bigger predators like Dunkleosteus that couldn't follow it into shallow water. But putting it in the shallows meant that it was close to the shoreline and therefore could see all that tasty, tasty food up on land. Tiktaalik seems to have been a lobe-finned fish that developed appendages for moving along the bottom more effectively. It got stronger, jointed fins that were making a more effective creeper along the shallow bottom. But that eventually meant that it could pull itself up out of the water for short periods of time. Your classic little fish with feet emerging onto land. Well, not little at all. Once Tiktaalik is poking its nose above the water, you're going to find that vertebrates take off in the land environment pretty quickly. By 360 million years ago, we have a critter called Ichthyostega. Ichthyostega. Ichthyostega is a primitive amphibian that is now exploiting the land-based environments. And we're seeing these amphibious forms of life that are adapting well to spending some time in the water and some time on land. They have a moist skin. They're still not fully defended against desiccation. They need to return to the water periodically. But there's lots of resources to exploit on land, and therefore your land-based animals are going to really diversify swiftly. Your amphibians have to stay close to the water initially, not only because of their moist skins, but also because they lay a gelatinous egg. And that gelatinous egg can only be sustained in a watery environment. The amphibians have a larval stage that is purely aquatic. But things start to get fun. First off, what I just mentioned here, I should back up for a second. There's a whole group of vertebrates that appears during this time that both Tiktaalik and Ichthyostega are early representatives of. A group of vertebrates sometimes called the tetrapods. T-A-T-R-A-P-O-D-S, tetrapod. Tetrapod literally means four-footed. These are your four-limbed animals. All living vertebrates, with the exception of fishes, are tetrapods. And so we're seeing the emergence of the tetrapoda, the lobe-finned fishes, and their immediate descendants during this time. Having four limbs ends up being a really good strategy for moving around on land. It means that you can support your weight front and back. It's a good number of limbs for remaining stable because you can afford to lift up a limb to use as a claw or climbing appendage or grabbing appendage while having three other limbs to keep your body stable. Developmentally, 4 is a lot easier to build than 6 or 8 or something like that, and as such, developmentally, that's where the vertebrates settle out. Digits take a little bit longer to settle out. We find that in the early days of vertebrate evolution, there's a wide range of numbers of digits that you will find on each appendage, anywhere from 4 to 10. And a lot of situations in which you will find that the organism has more digits on the front limbs or the hind limbs. Ichthyostega, we know, for example, had 7 digits on its hind limbs. We do not know how many it had on its forelimbs because we have not found a well enough preserved fossil of Ichthyostega to really know for sure at this point in time in terms of having a good example of a complete forelimb to look at. But it does appear that by the end of the Devonian period, around 359 million years ago, the default vertebrate condition for tetrapods has become pentadactyly. P-E-N-T-A-D-A-C-T-Y-L-Y, pentadactyly, which is the condition of having 5 digits per limb. Obviously, there are some vertebrates that have since lost some of those digits in their adaptations. Both birds and ungulates, like horses, have lost a lot of their digits as part of their individual adaptation, but developmentally, all tetrapods living today have 5 digits per limb. They all show 5 digits per limb in their early developmental stages, and that is the basic tetrapod model that ended up being the most effective, as in 5 digits sort of arrived by trial and error of natural selection as a good number of digits for a useful manipulating or climbing appendage, but not too many digits that are spending a lot of energy to develop. Now, the Paleozoic period is seeing a huge amount of diversification of life. We're going to see the so-called Age of Amphibians happening during this period, in which the amphibians are for a while the dominant forms of life. By the Carboniferous period, between 359 and 299 million years ago, we are going to see the emergence of the first winged insects, the first flying land animals, and by that time we are going to see the emergence of another kind of animal life, the reptile. By the end of the Paleozoic, in the Permian period, from 299 to 251 million years ago, we're seeing beetles, we're seeing flies, and reptiles are becoming a more and more common feature of the landscape. Pardon me. I skipped an important development along the way here. Important vertebrate developments. The emergence of a jaw. Now that doesn't sound like much, but jaws are a really important evolutionary innovation. The earliest vertebrates are so-called jawless fishes, meaning that they have kind of a fixed mouth rather than having a flexible, hinged jaw. The jawless fishes are going to be things that appear for the first time during your Ordovician period. The Ordovician period is after the Cambrian period, from about 488 million years ago to 443 million years ago. Your jawless fishes are going to basically have armored jaws, but not really teeth as we understand it. The Silurian period, from 443 to 416 million years ago, sees the emergence of the gnathostomes. G-N, silent G, G-N-A-T-H-O-S-T-O-M-E-S, gnathostomes. The gnathostomes are the so-called jawed fishes. Having a hinged jaw is a very significant evolutionary innovation. It's better for feeding. You can bite off food, whether that means biting off a chunk of plant matter or biting off a chunk of animal matter. It means that you can use your jaws as a weapon as well, both for hunting down prey and for defense. And it means that you can potentially chew your food. Chewing your food breaks it up more, which means that you can digest it more thoroughly by increasing its overall surface area. You can take in more energy faster. And that fosters the growth of larger and more complex animals still. So the gnathostome, or the jawed fish, is a really important evolutionary development, and it's going to be the jawed fishes that give rise to the lobe-finned fishes, which give rise ultimately to our amphibians. Now, from the amphibians, by the end of the Paleozoic, we're going to have the reptiles branching off. Paleozoic period ends with the Permian extinction. Permian extinction 251 million years ago, you might have heard me say before, single largest mass extinction event in the history of our planet. Life on Earth was nearly wiped out by it. Between 90 and 95% of all living things died during the Permian extinction. And we still are not 100% clear on why it happened. But what we do know is that at the end of the Permian, two major groups of vertebrates, that is, chordates with an endoskeleton, have appeared. And those vertebrates are going to be the amphibians, which we've already mentioned, your frogs, your salamanders, and so forth. The amphibia is the proper name for them. And another vertebrate group called the amniota. A-M-N-I-O-T-A. Amniota, or the amniotic vertebrates. The amniota are characterized by the development of a feature known as the amniotic egg. An amniotic egg is an egg that has a dry external shell, whether that shell is hard and mineralized like the egg of a bird, or whether that's a leathery shell like the egg of a snake. Either way, it's a dry shell that does not desiccate. More importantly, within that, you're going to find a thing called the amniotic sac. The amniotic sac is a bundle of nutrients located inside the egg surrounding the developing embryo within it. The embryo feeds upon those nutrients while it is in development. The cool thing about the amniotic egg is that means you don't need a larval stage. The embryo is able to develop fully inside of the egg and hatch as a miniature adult member of the species. Your amphibians have a gelatinous egg, which desiccates on land. It has to be laid in water. And that gelatinous egg is going to give rise to a larva, an organism that is not fully formed and has to feed extensively after birth in order to undergo metamorphosis and become its fully adult form. Think of the tadpole metamorphosing into a fully grown frog. Well, our reptiles are characterized by the evolution of the amniotic egg. That's the single biggest and most important feature of being a reptile, the amniotic egg, because A, that means their young are born fully formed. They don't have to go through a dangerous larval stage. 2, the amniotic egg means that the young are going to be able to emerge on land already. They don't have to be in the water for their initial stage of life. They can basically just stay on land all the time. For the first time, we now can have an organism that is fully terrestrially developed. Terrestrial, of course, meaning land-based. And my amniotic egg also means that I have an egg that I can lay on land. I can lay the egg in a terrestrial environment. I can build a nest on land, or I can even bury the egg like a lot of reptiles do, so that it can develop already present in situ. You're going to find that your reptile also is helping out with its development of scales. That scales provide a dry external surface to the skin of the animal that protects it from desiccation. So my reptile does not have to worry about returning to the water periodically to keep its skin moist. The evolutionary trade-off is a dry skin cannot engage in oxygen diffusion. Your amphibians have basically a full body respiratory membrane where they can engage in diffusion of oxygen from the atmosphere or from the water. But my reptile can't breathe in water anymore. Amphibians can, reptiles cannot. My reptile, however, has developed some lungs. We have some really nice lungs that we can use. Now, some amphibians do have lungs. They're much smaller and simpler than the lungs of amniotes, but the reptile really develops the lung to a much greater extent. Amniotic animals alive today. Members of the amniota include the reptiles, the birds, and, of course, the mammals. We are amniotes as well. We don't have a hard external egg because we develop in mom's womb. That's a later evolutionary development. But we do have the amniotic sac that surrounds the embryo during its developments. So by the end of the Paleozoic Era at 251 million years ago, those are the two major vertebrate groups that survive the Permian extinction, the amphibians and the amniotes. But you will find the amphibians have been greatly diminished. They don't do nearly as well. The age of amphibians ends with the Permian, and the amphibians never fully bounce back. They're still around, but they are a bit player in the ecosystem now as compared to the time when they were the dominant land animals. But the reptiles, with their amniotic eggs and their dry skins, are well positioned to begin taking over the land. Now, at the end of the Paleozoic, 251 million years ago, we have a couple of major reptile groups appearing. We have the beginnings of a group called the Pelecosaurs. The Pelecosaurs are a primitive early group of reptile, pre-dinosaur. We call them synapsids, meaning that they're animals that have an opening in the skull behind the eye. Now, the Pelecosaurs, a lot of times people think they're dinosaurs. If you remember Dimetrodon from your collection of toy dinosaurs when you were a kid, Dimetrodon had that sail on its back. which we don't really know what it's for. Edaphosaurus, another sail-backed reptile. Might have been a radiator for heat, might have been a display feature. We're not 100% certain. They're the dominant reptiles of this time period. But it's not going to remain for long. Pelycosaurs are going to be outcompeted by a more efficient reptile, because your pelycosaurs have legs that stick out to the side of their body at right angles, which means that their belly kind of hangs down between their legs. They have a very kind of form of motion where they plant one foot and then plant the next foot. It's a rather inefficient way of walking. Think of the way a lizard walks. But we're going to get a better kind of locomotion in the near future. We move now into the Mesozoic Era. The Mesozoic Era begins with the Permian extinction 251 million years ago, ends 65.5 million years ago with the KT event, the meteor strike that kills most of the big dinosaurs. Mesozoic Era is divided into three periods. You've probably heard of them. The Triassic period, from about 251 to 199 million years ago. The Jurassic period, from 199 to 145 million years ago. And the Cretaceous period, from about 145 to 65.5 million years ago. By the way, Mesozoic, Mesozoic. Triassic, Triassic. Jurassic, Jurassic. And Cretaceous, Cretaceous. Now, the Mesozoic Era is one you probably know pretty well already, whether you know it or not, because the Mesozoic Era comes to be known as the Age of Reptiles. This is when the reptile becomes the dominant vertebrate life form on land. Reptiles expand rapidly into new ecological niches. There are a lot of really important things that happen evolutionarily during the Mesozoic Era. Not all of them involve reptiles. We're going to find the first coral reefs forming during the Mesozoic Era. We're going to find the beginnings of the mammals. The first mammals appear early in the Mesozoic Era. Around 210 million years ago, we find the first primitive mammal fossils. Now, our early mammals branched off from the pelycosaurs. The pelycosaurs are going to go extinct not too long into the Mesozoic, but they're going to leave behind the mammals as their descendants. And your early mammals, the defining feature of being a mammal is secreting a nutrient-rich fluid, milk, that your young can feed upon. Your earliest mammals are going to have that, but their early mammals are still going to be kind of scaly. They're not going to have developed hair or fur yet. That comes a bit later. And importantly, our earliest mammals are egg-laying mammals, the monotremes, monotremes, of which there are only two living examples today, the platypus and the echidna or spiny anteater. So the things we associate with being a mammal, like having hair or fur and giving live birth to your young, are going to take some time to appear. Now, throughout the Mesozoic, of course, the reptiles are the dominant critters. And that means we usually are thinking about our buddies, the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs are going to become the major reptilian group during the Mesozoic. Reptiles are going to have a couple different forms. We're going to see the first snakes appearing during the Mesozoic, the first lizards as we know them now, the first turtles are going to appear during the Mesozoic. Actually, no, we had some early turtles during the Permian, my apologies, but a lot of turtles during the Mesozoic. The first crocodilians are going to appear during the Mesozoic. Actually, the crocodilians, if you don't know this, are the reptile group of the living reptiles that are most closely related to the dinosaurs. Now, what makes a dinosaur unique is that dinosaurs have their legs pulled underneath their bodies rather than splayed out to the side like a pelycosaur or a lizard does. Pulling the legs under the body centers the mass of the animal, gives it a better center of gravity, dramatically improves its locomotion. And therefore, dinosaurs are more energy efficient and can move around a lot more effectively. Dinosaurs diversify into an incredible range of ecological niches. You have predators, you have scavengers, you have herbivores, you have herd dwellers, you have solitary animals, you have quadrupeds, you have bipeds. You've got dinosaurs ranging from a little teensy 2-inch animal that we find fossils of preserved in amber in China, all the way up to the most massive animals that ever occupied the planet, the titanotheres, which are going to be 4-legged, long-necked, long-tailed reptiles that weighed in a staggering 150 tons. Find the sauropods that are like them. Sauropods are your long-necked, 4-legged, stump-legged, long-tailed herbivores, munching on plants, tromping around the landscape. We have learned that they were herd dwellers because we found massive trackways they have left behind. Stegosaurus, your buddy with the spiked tail and the plates on its back that we don't know what they're for either, is another example of a herd-dwelling herbivore with a beak-like mouth designed for cropping at plants. We have found their nests, and we know that these big herbivores took care of their young on that basis. We have examples of predators in a wide variety of configurations. A lot of our predatory dinosaurs are going to be bipeds, up on their hind legs, better turn of speed, frees up the forelimbs for clawing and grasping, sharp curved teeth for biting into prey, whereas your herbivores either have a beak-like mouth like Stegosaurus or blunt peg-like teeth like your sauropods for grinding and crushing food. Things like your Apatosaurus and your Diplodocus, for example. I'm not spelling these because I assume that you learned how to spell them when you were a kid and you loved dinosaurs when you were a kid and you still love dinosaurs, because why wouldn't you? You've got things, of course, like your Allosaurus. You've got things like your famous Velociraptor. Incidentally, the critter you see in Jurassic Park is not actually a Velociraptor. That is Velociraptor's larger and meaner cousin, a thing called Deinonychus. Deinonychus. Deinonychus is basically a Velociraptor on the size scale that you see in Jurassic Park. The animals they call velociraptors in Jurassic Park were modeled on Deinonychus. They just used the term velociraptor because, quite frankly, it sounds a lot more exciting. Actual velociraptors were think that animal, but scaled down to about the size of a turkey. And if that doesn't sound terribly threatening to you, imagine a pack of them with their sharp curved claws and jaws all leaping on you at once. We know from trackways that we have found and from skeletons of organisms killed by them that have lots of claw marks on their bodies, that Velociraptor was a pack hunter, and that they stalked their prey in packs. Now, I should point out that not all the dinosaurs lived at the same time. You know, you ask any little kid to draw a picture of dinosaurs for you, and you'll see, an Apatosaurus with its big long neck munching on trees, and a Stegosaurus maybe fighting a Triceratops with its 3 horns and its big frill behind its neck somewhere in the foreground. These animals didn't all know each other. They were not all buddies. They were not all alive at the same time. You're going to find that throughout the Mesozoic, dinosaurs come and go. By the time Triceratops and Tyrannosaurus are on the scene, your big sauropods and your Apatosaurus, your Diplodocus, your Stegosaurus, your Allosaurus, they've all been extinct for millions of years at that point. I like to point out the statistic that there was a longer period of time between when Stegosaurus lived and when Tyrannosaurus lived than there was between when Tyrannosaurus lived and when you were alive. So the Age of Dinosaurs covered a vast, vast chunk of time and contained a lot of evolutionary innovation, a lot of species coming and going and adapting to a gradually changing world. So we see a lot of really cool things going on. We could do a whole class on dinosaurs if we want to. Maybe I'll do that one day. But we are going to have a few other things we need to be discussing here. I should point out, not every reptile that we think of in this time period, not every prehistoric reptile is a dinosaur either. Let's think for a moment about your aquatic reptiles, because during this period, we're going to see a nifty evolutionary thing happening where some of the reptiles return to the oceans and begin adapting to a fully aquatic lifestyle. You have your mosasaurs, Mosasaurs, shark-like reptiles. Sharks, incidentally, have been around since the Triassic. They came around about the same time fishes did. They were the oldest fish-like animals. We have our plesiosaurs, Pleisosaurs. The plesiosaur is arguably the largest water-dwelling predator that has ever lived. It's your Loch Ness Monster-looking animal with the bulbous body, the big fins, and the long neck and the little head. Plesiosaurs were major predators in the Jurassic oceans. And we have our ichthyosaurs, I-C-H-Y-O. No, sorry, I-C-H-T-H-Y-O, my bad. S-A-U-R-S, ichthyosaur, which means fish lizard. Because our ichthyosaurs are going to be built along the lines of a fish. Streamlined body, stabilizing fin on its back, tail fin that can flap back and forth, side fins for propulsion. If you look inside their side fins, you can see bony evidence of their land-based origins because they have digits inside of that fused fin. Ichthyosaurus is pretty cool because it looks an awful lot like both a fish and a dolphin. Convergent evolution dictates that that's a pretty good body plan for a fast-moving, water-dwelling animal. And then, of course, we have our flying reptiles. By the way, none of those guys I mentioned were dinosaurs. Your mosasaurs, your ichthyosaurs, your plesiosaurs, those are other reptilian groups that are non-dinosaur reptiles. Not every extinct reptile is a dinosaur. Another major group of extinct reptiles that are not dinosaurs would be the pterosaurs. P-T-E-R-O-S-A-U-R-S, pterosaurs. The pterosaurs are your flying reptiles, the first winged vertebrates, having adapted the forelimb into initially a gliding appendage and then eventually into a fully powered wing. Pterosaurs, like modern birds, filled a wide range of ecological niches. We know that for them to take off, they had to run on the ground for a while. We have found the trackways of them running, where they would run and they would get faster and faster and faster until they would leap and take off. That was how their flight worked. It was not quite as efficient as modern bird flight, where they could take off from a standing start. Some pterosaurs were tiny little animals, the size of chickadees. Your pterodactyl, you've all heard of pterodactyl. Not every pterosaur is a pterodactyl. That's just one genus within the group. P-T-E-R-O-D-A-T... Wait, it's P-T-E-R-O-D-A-T-Y-L. Yeah, sorry, I got lost in the spelling. Pterodactyls were only about yay big, tiny little guys. But then you got things like Quetzalcoatlus. Q-U-E-T-A-L-Z-O-A... Wait, sorry. I'm sorry. I feel like I'm at a spelling bee trying to spell these words out loud. Q-U-E-T-Z-A-L-C-O-A-T-L-U-S. Quetzalcoatlus, named after the flying serpent lizard of Aztec mythology, Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatlus was, as far as we can tell, the largest flying animal that has ever lived. It was about the size of a Cessna light aircraft. A lot of these were diving predators that they had used their long, sharp beaks to swoop down and spear or grab food. So the first flying vertebrates. Now, both my water-dwelling reptile and my flying reptile, cool thing to know about them, those are very energy-intense lifestyles. When I look at my aquatic reptiles, they don't have gills. They got a blowhole on top of their head like a whale or a dolphin to take in oxygen. And the cool thing about this is that the really only way to sustain that kind of metabolism in an aquatic environment is to be warm-blooded. Likewise, the only way to sustain powered flight using the kind of musculature that we see evident in the attachments on the bones of pterosaurs, the only way to generate that much energy would be to be a warm-blooded animal. So being warm-blooded is a thing that came well before mammals. In fact, we are increasingly believing that a large percentage of the dinosaurs, including upright predators like Tyrannosaurus rex, were probably warm-blooded animals, that being warm-blooded was not a thing that was exclusive to mammals or birds. Speaking of, if you are picturing T-Rex or Velociraptor, and you are not picturing that animal covered in feathers, you are thinking about it wrong. Because as far as we can tell, a significant percentage of the dinosaurs, if not all of them, had a feathery outer covering on their bodies. We have found lots of fossil examples of feathers now, including entire feathers preserved in amber, and including impressions of feathers left in the mud that formed around the fossil of the dinosaur, even if the feathers themselves have decayed away. We don't know how colorful they were. Following the pattern of modern birds, we assume that some of them were more colorful than others. The males may have been more colorful as a mating display. Sexual selection is the thing we see with birds where the male tends to be more colorful. And let us remember, if you have forgotten this fact, that a bird is a dinosaur. Bird-like dinosaurs begin appearing in the fossil record somewhere in the vicinity of 160 to 185 million years ago. That's when we first see evidence of your bird-like dinosaurs, your flying dinosaurs with feathered wings. They are not related to pterosaurs. This is a completely separate evolutionary innovation. The famous example, of course, is Archaeopteryx, 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 which is a winged feathered dinosaur that was found preserved in a block of stone in Germany back in the 19th century, conveniently discovered actually right about the same time Darwin was talking about transition fossils in his Origin of Species. He published The Origin in 1859. Archaeopteryx was discovered in 1861. So really good timing for that fossil to have been found. But you look at Archaeopteryx and you see a constellation of bird-like features and dinosaur-like features. So you've got a long bony tail, like you'd expect a dinosaur to have. You have a jawed mouth with teeth rather than a beak. But you also have a furculum or wishbone to anchor the wings, and you have a reversed hind toe, like you see in modern birds. So Archaeopteryx shows us a great example of a transitional fossil, an organism that is moving towards what we know today to be a more bird-like anatomy. Early bird-like dinosaurs looked an awful lot like, big mean turkeys. You're going to find some of them have very odd body plans, including some that had 4 wings rather than 2, that their hind limb was a wing-like appendage as well. But little by little, the so-called avian dinosaurs are going to chart their own evolutionary course, branching off from the rest of the Dinosauria. Now, a little taxonomic problem I want to mention here that if you've had me in class before, you've heard me bring up, that our current way of classifying vertebrates is wrong. Because right now we divide up the phylum Chordata, subphylum Vertebrata, into several distinct classes of vertebrates, the well-known ones being, of course, the fishes, the mammals, the amphibians, the reptiles, and the birds. Here's the thing. Leaving birds out of reptiles is incorrect from a taxonomic standpoint because birds are dinosaurs. They are literally members of the order Dinosauria. They have all of the characteristic anatomical features that identify an organism as a dinosaur. So birds are the last of the dinosaurs. They are living dinosaurs. You eat a dinosaur for Thanksgiving dinner. Now, given that, we should not be shuttling off the birds into a separate class from the reptiles. Right now, classical taxonomy has the class Reptilia for reptiles and the class Aves, A-V-E-S, for birds. It's not correct because the birds properly belong as a subgroup within the order Dinosauria, the order Dinosauria being one of several orders within the class Reptilia. Therefore, we should really more properly be placing birds within the Reptilia as a suborder within the order Dinosauria. Some taxonomists, myself included, favor a reorganization of the classification to do away with Reptilia and Aves altogether, put them together into one collective class, which some of my colleagues have called the Sauropodomorpha. Capital S-A-U-R-O-P-O-D-O-M-O-R-P-H-A, Sauropodomorpha. So the class Sauropodomorpha would be a more taxonomically accurate group, containing both birds and reptiles, and properly classifying birds as members of order Dinosauria. All right, so that's giving you a picture of Mesozoic taxonomic diversity. Well, 65.5 million years ago, you all know what's happening. Big old meteor, the Chicxulub meteor, comes down out of the sky. Dinosaurs all look up from whatever they're doing to see what's happening. There's that one T-Rex you see in the background of every single picture where this is happening, where there's always one T-Rex looking up at the meteor, looking, oh, that can't be good, But Chicxulub meteor slams into the planet, You know how this works. Dinosaurs all fly up in the air and die. It's not really how it worked. But 65.5 million years ago, KT events. K/T, capital letters. This is the end of the Mesozoic Era. 75% of all life on Earth is wiped out, including most of the dinosaurs. The big reptiles do not do well in what is effectively a nuclear winter that comes after the meteor strike, when the sun is largely blotted out for a long period of time. The big forests of the Mesozoic Era, the non-flowering trees, die off. The big plant eaters that rely on them die off. The big meat eaters that rely on them die off. Primary survivors of the KT event among land vertebrates are going to be the little-bodied animals, because the little-bodied animals are much better positioned to weather the storm. Your crocodilians are the only big-bodied reptiles that really make it through. Why? Because a crocodilian has a metabolism more similar to a warm-blooded animal. They have a four-chambered heart, which is much more efficient at energy generation and therefore much more efficient at producing body heat. And the mammals and the birds, warm-blooded, small-bodied animals with four-chambered hearts, do super well. They are the main survivors. So once the dust settles from the KT event after tens of thousands of years, it doesn't happen all at once, it unfolds over tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And that means as we move into the Cenozoic Era, capital Cenozoic, the Cenozoic Era is well positioned to become the Age of Mammals. Now, I'm not going to say as much about the Cenozoic. This is a somewhat more familiar time period to us. Some major evolutionary trends. We're going to find a massive expansion of angiosperm plants, flowering plants, after the KT event, largely replacing the non-flowering gymnosperms that mostly died off at the end of this time. And that means you're going to find a flourishing of pollinating insects. Your bees and their affiliates are going to do really well following the KT events. Birds and mammals are going to undergo adaptive radiation. They are going to move into the ecological space left behind by the extinction of the big reptiles. And pretty soon you're going to see a tremendous diversification of both bird and mammal. Mammals are going to become really the big dominant terrestrial vertebrates. You're going to find mammals that are herbivores, that are carnivores, that are scavengers, tremendous range of mammal species that appear, most of which in the early Cenozoic are not with us anymore. A lot of extinct mammals from this time, a lot of megafauna, Megafauna, literally translates as real big animal. Your megafauna are your massive, heavy animals that end up replacing the massive, heavy reptiles. Think of your woolly mammoth or your woolly rhino or a lot of other lesser-known big, weird mammals that were prowling around about this time. Now, we're going to see some really interesting things happening throughout the Cenozoic Era. By 60 million years ago, a group of small mammals called tree shrews have splintered off and developed an opposable thumb. The primates appear about 60 million years ago, and initially they look an awful lot like little squirrels, but they too are going to diversify as a primarily arboreal animal. Arboreal, arboreal meaning tree dwelling. Sometime between 55 and 33 million years ago, we see the return of some mammals to the waters. We're going to see by about 35 million years ago, we're going to see whales, dolphins, and their affiliates. By about 30 million years ago, we are going to see the first apes, the first tailless primates beginning to appear. During this time, we're also going to start seeing somewhere around 20-25 million years ago, the first horses, horse-like animals, your ungulates, your fusion of toes is going to happen between 20 million years ago and 5 million years ago to form your hooved animals. Your early elephants, your mastodons, and so forth are going to appear during the Miocene period between 23 million and 5.3 million years ago. And about 7 million years ago, in Eastern Africa, we are going to see the emergence of the family Hominidae, capital Hominidae. Nidae, family Hominidae, the upright walking apes, the first human-like animals. Upright walking apes are going to largely remain in Africa until approximately 1.8 million years ago, when they are going to begin tentatively creeping out of Africa into the Asian continent initially. It's going to take them till about a million years ago to make their way to Europe. It's going to take them until actually about, very recently, about 30,000 years ago to make their way to the Americas. The most recent ice age begins about 2.5 million years ago, right about the same time that an animal called Homo habilis, H-A-B-I-L-I-S, the earliest member of genus Homo, our species, our group, is going to appear. And Homo habilis is going to be the first tool maker. The word habilis means handyman. Little by little, humans are going to diversify, spread out across the world. We're going to see throughout the Ice Age tremendous radiation of humans, lots of human species alive at once. We're going to find the emergence of the Neanderthals. We're going to find the emergence of Homo erectus. We're going to find a lot of early genus Homo species. Now, in the late Ice Age, about 75,000 years ago, an animal called Homo sapiens makes its way to Europe. Homo sapiens first appeared in northern Africa about 200 million years ago. As far as we can tell, didn't leave Africa till somewhere in the vicinity of about 90 to 100,000 years ago. Found its way to Europe by about 75,000 years ago. Wherever we showed up, other hominids went extinct. Increasing evidence suggests that we were interbreeding with them, that you probably have some Neanderthal DNA creeping around in your lineage. The Neanderthals were gradually pushed back till about between 35 and 25,000 years ago. The last of them died off or were absorbed by Homo sapiens populations. The last non-Homo sapiens variety of human, a dwarfed variety of human called Homo floresiensis, F-L-O-R-E-S-I-E-N-S-I-S, Homo floresiensis. Little tiny humans that at adult height only lived to be about 3 feet tall. They're sometimes called the Hobbit people. They were living in Flores Island in what is now Indonesia, and they may have lasted until as recently as 10,000 years ago. And from that point onward, we have been the last of our kind. Family Hominidae has had about 30 different species and at least 6 different genera during its history, and Homo sapiens is the only one remaining, which among other things means that as an evolutionary experiment, upright walking ape has not worked very well. The Holocene epoch within the Neogene period, within the Cenozoic Era, began with the end of the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago. The end of the last ice age corresponded with the extinction of lots of megafauna. The big hairy woolly mammoths and woolly rhinos, and cave bears and Irish elk, these massive fuzzy animals that had big heavy bodies to survive in the cold ice age climate, began dying off, partly as a result of changing climate, partly as a result of human predation. We very quickly outcompeted a lot of these critters, and we spread and diversified. And here we are today, living in the Anthropocene epoch that began in the 1950s with the start of human nuclear testing, a new geologic epoch, and we are living, as you all know by now, in the midst of a mass extinction events, in which a significant percentage of life on Earth is probably going to be dying in the not-too-distant future. Somewhere around 1 out of 6 species are probably going to perish in the relatively near future. Because mass extinction events, of course, are one of those things that tends to mark geologic epochal shifts, and we're really only like 70 years into the current epoch. Okay, that has been our capsule history of animal life. It's run a little bit longer than a standard lecture, but I kind of wanted to tie it all off there. Obviously, we could have said a lot more about specific parts of this, but I wanted to give you all at least a little bit of a picture of what was going on in animal history. If you go on my Blackboard site and find my geologic time scale, you'll find notes in the sidebar of that scale of when specific events in geologic history, when particular groups of animals were first emerging. Our next lesson is going to deal with the topic of animal body plans and development. So to close out this chapter, we're going to take a look at the animal body plan, how animals are put together, and the different ways that animal bodies develop. And that should be about the end of this unit. Hope you all are having a great day. I'll talk to you soon.